The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. Picture yourself running a professional basketball team, like the Houston Rockets. Your most crucial job? Deciding which young college hopeful to draft. We're talking millions of dollars, and the entire future of your franchise hanging in the balance. You bring a talented young man into the interview room. He's incredibly gifted, a giant even by basketball standards. The scouts are in love with him. You ask a simple question. Do you prefer Kenneth or Kenny? He looks you straight in the eye and says, Manimal. He wants to be called Manimal. So, what do you do with that? Another player walks in. Great resume, but a sketchy reputation. You bring up a marijuana possession charge and ask what happened his junior year. He just shakes his head with a grin and says, They stopped testing me, and if you're not going to test me, I'm going to smoke. Then there's Marc Gasol, a European player. Your statistical models are screaming that he's going to be a star. But your scouts, guys who've been breathing basketball their entire lives, found a shirtless photo of him. He's a little pudgy. They give him a nickname, Man Boobs. Every single time his name comes up, someone snickers and says, Oh, man boobs. And just like that, all the data goes out the window. The expert gut feeling, shaped by one unflattering photo and a ridiculous nickname, wins. These aren't made-up scenarios. They're real situations faced by Daryl Morey, general manager of the Houston Rockets, a man trying to use data and logic in a world dominated by expert intuition. What he discovered, and what Michael Lewis brilliantly reveals in The Undoing Project, is that the human mind, even the expert mind, is deeply flawed. It's a storytelling machine, not a calculator. It's packed with hidden biases, mental shortcuts, and invisible rules that cause us to make systematic, predictable mistakes. What Morey was battling in basketball reflected a much deeper truth about all of us. He was witnessing the effects of a discovery made years earlier by two men who couldn't have been more different. Daniel Kahneman, defined by doubt, and Amos Tversky, defined by confidence. These two Israeli psychologists formed an intense, beautiful, and ultimately tragic friendship that led them to map the hidden machinery of the human mind. Their work wasn't just about basketball. It was about how doctors diagnose patients, how investors pick stocks, how politicians lead nations, and how you and I make countless small and large decisions that shape our lives. Today, we're going to explore their story. By the end, you'll understand the invisible glitches in your own thinking. You'll see why you trust a confident speaker even when they're wrong, why you fear rare disasters more than common dangers, and why a good story can overpower hard facts. This isn't just a book summary. It's a journey into the inner workings of your own mind, guided by the friendship that changed how we understand ourselves. Our story starts not in a psychology lab, but in the high-stakes world of professional basketball. Daryl Morey, general manager of the Houston Rockets, had a radical idea. He believed the traditional way of picking players, relying on experienced scouts, gut feelings, was broken. These experts, for all their wisdom, constantly made errors. They'd fall in love with a player who looked good, who was handsome and fit, and overestimate his talent. They'd dismiss an overweight or awkward player, even if his performance statistics were outstanding. Morey saw that the human mind was drawn to good stories. A player who overcame incredible adversity had a story that was irresistible, creating a clear but often false picture of future success. Morey's job was to fight this. As he put it, your mind needs to be in a constant state of defense against all this crap that is trying to mislead you. He wanted to replace gut feelings with data, building statistical models to predict future performance based purely on what a player actually did on the court. But even Morey, the king of numbers, found the human element impossible to escape. He noticed a strange pattern called confirmation bias. A scout would form an almost instant impression of a player, then spend the rest of his time arranging all the evidence to support that first impression. If a scout liked a player, he'd say the player was multi-positional. If he didn't like him, he'd say the same player has no position. One of the most powerful examples was Jeremy Lin. Lin, a Chinese-American guard from Harvard, entered the 2010 draft. Maury's statistical model lit up, saying Lin should be picked around 15th overall. But when experts looked at Jeremy Lin, they didn't see an NBA player. They saw an Asian kid who didn't look athletic to their eyes. Every team, including Maury's Rockets, passed on him. A year later, they developed a new way to measure athletic ability, specifically the speed of a player's first 2 steps. Who was the quickest player they'd ever measured? Jeremy Lin. As Maury later admitted, he's incredibly athletic. But the reality is that every person, including me, thought he was unathletic. And I can't think of any reason for it other than he was Asian. The problem wasn't that experts were stupid. The problem was that the human mind has defaults, shortcuts. It uses stereotypes and simple stories to make sense of a complex world. These shortcuts, while often useful, can lead to massive, systematic errors. What Daryl Morey was discovering through painful trial and error, 2 psychologists had figured out decades earlier through a partnership that was nothing short of an intellectual love affair. Their names were Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. To understand their work, you must first understand the men themselves, because they were as different as night and day. Daniel Kahneman, or Danny as everyone called him, was a man shaped by error. His defining emotion was doubt. Born in Paris, his earliest memories were of being a Jewish child in Nazi-occupied France. He remembered wearing the yellow Star of David on his sweater, turning it inside out on the street so no one would see. One evening, he was out past curfew and saw a German soldier in the feared black SS uniform approaching. Danny was terrified, but the soldier beckoned him over, picked him up, and hugged him. He spoke emotionally in German, then pulled out his wallet, showed Danny a picture of a little boy, and gave him some money. Danny went home thinking about what his mother always told him. People were endlessly complicated and interesting. His entire childhood was a lesson in uncertainty. He was a rabbit in a rabbit hunt, surviving on false identities, hiding in barns and chicken coops. He learned to trust no one, to observe everything, and most of all, to doubt. He doubted his own memory, his own judgment, his own mind. This profound, lifelong sense of his own fallibility would become his greatest intellectual tool. As a young man in the Israeli army, long before becoming world famous, he was tasked with designing a system to evaluate new recruits and identify future officers. The existing system was based on interviews and field exercises where senior officers used expert intuition to judge character. Danny, being Danny, decided to check if their predictions were any good. After watching seasoned officers declare with great confidence, "This one will be a star," or "That one will never make it," he compared their judgments to how recruits actually performed in officer training. The result? The expert predictions were completely worthless, no better than random guesses. Yet even after knowing this, Danny noticed something incredible. When he went back to watch the exercise, he still felt the same confidence in his own ability to spot future leaders. His knowledge of the statistical truth didn't change his gut feeling. He called this his Muller-Lyer illusion moment, after the famous optical illusion, where 2 equal lines appear different sizes. Even when you know it's an illusion, you can't stop seeing it. What if, Danny wondered, Our thinking worked the same way. What if our judgments were subject to cognitive illusions, just as powerful and persistent as visual ones? And then there was Amos Tversky. If Danny embodied doubt, Amos was pure certainty. He was the quintessential Israeli hero, a sabra, prickly on the outside, sweet on the inside. He was a decorated paratrooper, impossibly brave, with a mind of such terrifying clarity that people were often afraid to speak in front of him. The stories about Amos are legendary. As a boy, he was challenged to jump off a 10-meter diving platform, but he didn't know how to swim. So he found a big kid, told him he was going to jump, and instructed the kid to be in the pool to pull him up from the bottom. And he did it. During his army service, a soldier in his unit fainted on top of a live explosive with seconds to go. While his commanding officer shouted for everyone to stay put, Amos ignored the order, sprinted out, grabbed the unconscious soldier, and threw himself on top of him, just as the torpedo exploded. He carried the shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. Amos was the most popular, most confident, most brilliant person anyone had ever met. Psychologist Dick Nisbett once said he had a one-line intelligence test. The sooner you figure out that Amos is smarter than you are, the smarter you are. Physicists would talk to him for an hour and come away convinced he was the smartest physicist they'd ever met, only to learn he was a psychologist. He lived life on his own terms. He had a rule: unless you're kicking yourself once a month for throwing something away, you're not throwing enough away. He had another rule for dealing with mail. He'd let it pile up on a long table. Each day, new mail would arrive and push the old mail further down. When a pile reached the end of the table, he'd sweep it, unopened, into the garbage. The nice thing about things that are urgent, he'd say, is that if you wait long enough, they aren't urgent anymore. Where Danny saw complexity and doubt, Amos saw clarity and conviction. Danny was the question mark, Amos was the exclamation point. And in spring 1969, these two forces collided in a small seminar room at Hebrew University. Danny had invited Amos to speak to his graduate students. Amos, being the mathematical psychologist he was, decided to talk about cutting-edge research from the University of Michigan. The research claimed that people, when making judgments under uncertainty, were pretty good, intuitive statisticians. The theory assumed that while we might not know complex probability formulas, our minds naturally behave as if we do. They called people conservative Bayesians, meaning we update our beliefs in the right direction when given new evidence, just not quite enough. As Amos spoke, Danny was baffled. This theory seemed incredibly stupid to him. From his own experience, he knew he was a lousy intuitive statistician. He'd made countless errors in his own research, using sample sizes that were too small, wrongly believing a small group could represent the whole. If he, a professor who taught statistics, made these mistakes, why would he believe ordinary people were secretly brilliant statisticians? He saw that this theory, this idea of the rational mind, was another illusion. When Amos finished, Danny did what Israelis did in academic seminars. He attacked. He told Amos the research made no sense, that it had no psychology in it, that it ignored the obvious truth about how people actually think. He argued that the human mind doesn't work by the rules of probability, it works by rules of thumb, by mental shortcuts. And these shortcuts lead to predictable errors. Amos, the man who was never wrong, who could dismantle any argument with a single sentence, was shaken. He left that seminar in a state highly unusual for him: doubt. Danny had shown him a crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about decision-making. That argument was the beginning of everything. They started talking. At first, just a few lunches. But soon, they were inseparable. They'd disappear into a small seminar room for hours, and the only sound emerging from behind the closed door was laughter. It was, as Danny later described it, a meeting of minds more intimate than a marriage. "We were sharing a mind," he said. "I would say something and Amos would understand it better than I did. It still gives me goosebumps." Together they set out to answer the question Danny had raised. If people aren't intuitive statisticians, what are they? If they don't use logic and probability to judge uncertain situations, what do they use instead? Their answer was simple and profound. The mind has a set of shortcuts for making judgments. They called these shortcuts heuristics. These are the mind's rules of thumb. They're fast, they're efficient, and most of the time, they work beautifully. But in certain predictable situations, they lead us into error. These errors they called biases. The bias is the footprint left behind by the heuristic. The first major heuristic they identified was representativeness. This is the rule that says we judge the likelihood of something by how much it resembles a stereotype or mental model we already have. The more something matches our mental picture, the more likely we think it is. To demonstrate its power, they created a character named Linda. They gave people a short description. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then they asked a simple question: which is more probable? 1. Linda is a bank teller, or 2. Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Over 85% of people chose option 2, but logically, that's impossible. The group of bank tellers includes all bank tellers, including those who are feminists and those who aren't. The group of feminist bank tellers is a smaller subset, so it can never be more probable. But the description of Linda is so representative of a feminist that our minds are seduced by the story. The story is more plausible, so we judge it as more probable, even when it violates a fundamental law of logic. This experiment was so powerful that Amos called it winning by embarrassment. It showed that even when logic is staring us in the face, a good story can blind us to it. The second heuristic they discovered was availability. This rule is even simpler. The easier it is to recall examples of something, the more frequent and probable we judge it to be. They asked people, in the English language, are there more words that start with the letter K, or more words that have K as the third letter? Overwhelmingly, people said there are more words that start with K. The truth is, there are more than twice as many words with K as the third letter, but it's much easier for our minds to search for words by their first letter. Words like kitchen and king pop into our heads instantly. Words like ask and bake take more effort. Because the examples are more available, we mistake that ease of recall for higher frequency. This isn't just a party trick. Think about it in your own life. After you see a dramatic movie about a plane crash, or hear a news story about a shark attack, you temporarily feel these events are much more likely to happen. Your judgment of risk is being distorted by the vividness and availability of the memory, not by actual statistics. The third major heuristic they explored was anchoring. They found that when people are asked to estimate an unknown number, they're powerfully influenced by the first number they hear, even if that number is completely random and irrelevant. In one famous experiment, they'd spin a wheel of fortune in front of people, then ask them to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. People who saw the wheel land on a high number like 65 gave a much higher estimate than people who saw it land on a low number, like 10. The random number on the wheel served as an anchor, pulling their final judgment toward it. This is why the first number mentioned in any negotiation, whether for a car or a salary, is so incredibly powerful. After mapping how people judge probabilities, Amos turned to Danny and said, "We're finished with judgment. Let's do decision-making." It was time to attack the central theory of economics, the idea that humans are rational actors who make choices to maximize their own utility. At the heart of economic theory was the idea that people are generally risk-averse. Given a choice between a sure thing and a gamble with slightly higher expected value, people usually take the sure thing. For example, most people would prefer a guaranteed $500 over a 50-50 coin flip to win $1,000. This seemed sensible enough. But as Danny read through the literature, he noticed a giant hole in the theory. It was all based on absolute levels of wealth. The theory assumed that a person with $5 million is equally happy as another person with $5 million. But, Danny thought, what if one of them started with $1 million yesterday and the other started with $9 million? Are they equally happy now? Of course not. One is ecstatic, the other is miserable. What matters isn't our absolute state, it's the change from our reference point. This was a key insight, but the true breakthrough came when Amos asked a simple, brilliant question. What if we flip the signs? What if, instead of choices between gains, we looked at choices between losses? What they discovered was astonishing. When faced with a choice between a sure gain and a gamble, people are risk-averse. They take the sure thing. But when faced with a choice between a sure loss and a gamble, people suddenly become risk-seeking. They'll risk a bigger loss for the chance to lose nothing at all. If you offer someone a choice between a guaranteed loss of $500 and a 50-50 coin flip to lose $1,000, most people will choose the coin flip. They'd rather gamble. This led to their most famous discovery, loss aversion. The pain of losing something is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining the same thing. To get someone to accept a 50-50 bet, you can't just offer them the chance to win $100 versus losing $100. You have to offer them the chance to win at least $200, to compensate for the pain of potentially losing $100. This simple idea explains so much about human behavior. But they took it one step further with the concept of framing. They showed that the way a choice is described or framed can completely change the decision, even if the underlying facts are identical. Their most famous example was the Asian disease problem. They presented a scenario. Imagine the U.S. is preparing for an outbreak of a disease expected to kill 600 people. They gave one group two options. Program A, 200 people will be saved. Program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. The vast majority chose Program A. They took the sure thing. They were risk-averse for gains. They gave a second group the exact same scenario but framed the options differently. Program C, 400 people will die. Program D, there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. Now the vast majority chose Program D. They gambled. But look closely. Program A and Program C are identical outcomes. Program B and Program D are also identical outcomes. The only thing that changed was the description. When the choice was framed as saving lives, a gain, people avoided risk. When framed as people dying, a loss, they sought risk. The conclusion was revolutionary. People do not choose between things, they choose between descriptions of things. With this, they created prospect theory, a new model of decision-making that accounted for the psychological realities of how people actually choose. It was math with psychology in it. But as their ideas were taking over the world, their friendship was beginning to fracture. In 1978, they both left Israel for North America. Amos was given a prestigious chaired professorship at Stanford. Danny, feeling overshadowed and underappreciated, took a position at the less glamorous University of British Columbia. The physical distance created an emotional one. The world began to see them not as a pair but as Amos Tversky and that other guy. The public perception of their collaboration became a Venn diagram where Danny's circle was wholly contained by Amos's. Amos was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant for work they'd done together. Danny's name wasn't mentioned. Amos was privately furious about it, seeing it as a death blow to their collaboration. But the damage was done. The joy and magic of their partnership, the feeling of sharing a single mind, began to fade, replaced by envy and resentment. Danny, always sensitive to unrealized possibilities, began exploring the psychology of regret and undoing. This was work he started alone, inspired by the tragic death of his nephew, a fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force. He noticed that when people mentally undo a tragedy, their imagination follows rules. We don't undo just anything. We undo the most unusual or surprising element of the story. A man who takes an unusual route home from work and gets into a fatal accident prompts everyone to think, if only he'd taken his usual route. But if he's killed on his usual route, no one thinks, if only he'd taken a different route. The mind goes downhill, undoing the exceptional action to restore normality. The end of their story is tragic. Their intellectual marriage dissolved into a painful divorce. The final blow came during a talk in Michigan. After Danny presented his new solo work on undoing, a colleague approached them, amazed, and asked where all the ideas came from. Amos replied, "Danny and I don't talk about these things." To Danny, it felt like a public disavowal, a moment when Amos could have shared the credit and chose not to. They remained friends, but the collaboration was over. Then, in 1996, Amos called Danny with devastating news. He had terminal cancer and, at best, 6 months to live. He was 59 years old. Danny was the second person he told. In those final months, some of the old magic returned. They spoke nearly every day. Amos, the man who had faced down death his whole life, faced his own with stoic calm that astonished everyone. He told a friend, "Life is a book. The fact that it was a short book doesn't mean it wasn't a good book. It was a very good book." Amos died in June 1996. 6 years later, in 2002, the phone rang in Danny Kahneman's home in Princeton. It was the Nobel Committee. He'd been awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for the work he and Amos had done together. The prize isn't awarded posthumously, so Amos's name wasn't on the award, but in his acceptance speech, and in every interview he gave, Danny made it clear that the prize belonged to them both. He carried Amos to Stockholm with him. So what do we take away from this incredible story? The Undoing Project is more than just the biography of a friendship. It's a map of our own minds. The work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky reveals a fundamental truth. Our brains are magnificent, but they're not built for perfect, logical reasoning. They're storytelling machines, designed by evolution to make quick judgments based on limited information. And the tools they use, these heuristics of representativeness, availability, and anchoring, are both our greatest strength and our most profound weakness. The most powerful lesson, for me, is the humility this knowledge should inspire in all of us. We're all walking around with an illusion of understanding, a sense of certainty about our judgments that's often completely unjustified. We see a confident leader and assume they're competent. We hear a frightening story and overestimate the risk. We fall for a detailed plan, even if it's less likely to succeed than a simple one. We're all, in our own way, like the basketball scouts who dismissed a future superstar because they nicknamed him Man Boobs. This isn't a pessimistic conclusion. It's an empowering one. Because once you understand the glitches in your own thinking, you can start to guard against them. This is the real undoing project. The project of undoing our own certainty and replacing it with a healthy dose of curiosity and doubt. So how can we apply this in our own lives? Here are a few simple, practical actions you can start taking today. First, practice taking the outside view. When you're making a big decision, choosing a career path, starting a business, anything with an uncertain outcome, your first instinct will be to construct a story based on your unique situation. Fight that urge. Instead, look for the base rate. Find data on how similar decisions have turned out for other people. If you're starting a restaurant, don't just focus on your brilliant concept. Find out what percentage of new restaurants fail in the first 5 years. This outside view provides a dose of reality that can counteract the seductive power of your own story. Second, always reframe the choice. If you're facing a tough decision, don't just look at it one way. Consciously write it down in 2 different frames, once in terms of what you stand to gain, and once in terms of what you stand to lose. As the Asian disease problem shows us, simply changing the description can completely alter your preference. By forcing yourself to see the decision from both angles, you can get a more balanced perspective and make a choice that's less influenced by the emotional pull of loss aversion. Finally, conduct a a pre-mortem. This is a powerful technique that Danny himself recommends. Before you begin any important project, gather your team and imagine it's a year from now, and the project has failed completely. Now each of you has 5 minutes to write down all the reasons why it failed. This exercise does something remarkable. It legitimizes doubt. It frees people from the pressure to be optimistic and allows them to tap into a different kind of creativity, the creativity of spotting potential disasters. It turns the availability heuristic to your advantage, making potential failures easier to imagine and therefore easier to prevent. The story of Danny and Amos is ultimately a story of how 2 people, by combining their unique ways of seeing the world, gave us a richer, truer picture of ourselves. Their work teaches us that the path to wisdom begins with the humble admission that we don't know as much as we think we do. It's a reminder that the most important decisions we make aren't about being right, but about understanding the odds and playing them well. That was a summary of The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. We've certainly covered the main ideas today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. It can show you the layout, the major cities, the rivers, but it can't give you the feeling of walking through the streets, smelling the food, and hearing the music. The real magic of this book is in the stories, the details, and the profound humanity that Michael Lewis brings to the lives of these 2 incredible men. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. It's more than a book about psychology. It's a love story, a tragedy, and a scientific adventure, all rolled into one. It's an experience that will leave you thinking differently, not just about the world, but about the very mind you use to see it. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found value in our journey together today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Billionaire's Bookshelf. It helps us continue to bring you these deep dives into books that can change your life. Let's keep learning and keep growing together.